So at Apple's event, I noticed something in the keynote, specifically as it pertains to the A15 chip. Now, you may have noticed this too. It was that they didn't compare it at all to the previous A14 chip from last year's iPhone. There were vague comparisons to unnamed competitors, sort of like what they did with the M1 event last year, where they said, it's faster than most people, just take our word for it. And it was a little weird. I was curious as to why Apple was hiding the performance of this new chip. And it seems like there might be a problem. Or there might not be. Either way, but let's discuss. Today's video is sponsored by Autonomous. Their new Ergo Chair Pro delivers superior comfort and maximum adjustment at an affordable price. The Ergo Chair Pro features adjustable height, armrests, backrests, and seat tilt. It can recline with 5 lockable seat back positions, has adjustable lumbar and headrest support. Additionally, the Ergo Chair Pro uses a light and breathable woven mesh design for the backrest. It comes in 6 fun colors to match your home office or your gaming setup. Oh, sorry, I fell asleep because of how comfortable this is, not just for work, but also for relaxation. I really like the recline feature of the Ergo Chair Pro because it lets you adjust the tension, so you can have good back support for when you're working, and you can recline very easily. The adjustments on this chair are plentiful but easy to use, and they allow you to fine-tune your chair to match your needs perfectly. Now, Autonomous is offering you guys 5% off this Ergo Chair Pro if you use the link in the description below with coupon code 21LukeMiani5. So go check out the Ergo Chair Pro. You can see which of the 6 fun colors is best for you, save some money while you're at it, and soon you too can be reclining. And now, back to the video. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on right now with the A15 chip. So the new iPhone 13 has been a little bit controversial. Some people are saying, well, kinda sucks. Your opinion on that is probably valid, whether you like it or whether you don't. There's reasons for both of those. But one thing that really does stand out to me is the lack of year-over-year performance gains. Now, I say the lack because if Apple had important things to share about crazy new performance, you bet they would put up a vaguely marked graph to show us how amazing it was. And for the past 10 years of iPhone updates, there have been substantial improvements almost every year. So it's weird to see that stop, right? It's one thing to have iPhone chips that aren't getting that much faster year over year. Phone chips are really fast now, and you don't necessarily need more power. But Apple is now propositioning their platform as the future for their entire company. How can we have confidence that Apple is ready to deliver a Mac Pro with their own chips that can beat out the best of AMD Threadripper and Intel Xeon when they can't improve an iPhone chip? Well, as you might expect, this issue is a little bit more complex than just, Apple can't innovate anymore, they suck. So let's really dive into it and discuss. Now, when Apple was discussing the A15, they put up this graphic. It's the typical format that they love to put up, and they say, oh wow, look at that. 2 times the system cache, 15.8 trillion operations per second. But they also say 50% faster CPU versus competition, and 30% faster GPU, again, versus competition. Now, typically in past years, that would be versus A15 Bionic or versus previous chip, but they didn't do that this year. Now, I'm curious to know, did you guys pick up on this in the keynote? And if so, what are your thoughts? Do you think that the A15 is underwhelming compared to previous iPhone chip upgrades? Let me know in the comments below. In order to find out how this new A15 actually compares to previous chips, we have to go look at a different part of the keynote, the iPad mini. Because with the iPad mini, much like they did with the iPad Air last year, they compared it to the previous version. And the previous version of the iPad mini was running an A12. So they're comparing it to 3 generations ago. So already that's a little bit questionable in terms of, is this really a valid comparison? but it does at least give us some numbers that we can look at. So Apple said that the A15 in the iPad mini compared to the A12 in the iPad mini previous generation has a 40% faster CPU and 80% faster GPU. Now that is where people get alarmed, because the A15 compared to the A12 is 40% faster CPU. The A14 compared to the A12 is 40% faster CPU. So that means that by Apple's own numbers, the A15 has no performance gains compared to the 14, at least for the CPU. If we look at the GPU, we're looking at somewhere between a 30 to 40% increase versus last year. And I suspect that's because Apple is now shipping two different variants of the A15 with different GPUs. So if you recall from Apple's presentation, there are now two different variants of the A15 that are shipping. So the iPhone 13, just a normal one, has a 4-core GPU, but the 13 Pro and Pro Max have a 5-core GPU. Now, Apple hasn't actually confirmed which of these GPUs are in the iPad mini, but given those performance gains, I'm gonna assume that Apple is shipping the 5-core GPU. But it's a pretty interesting situation here to be looking at up to 30% or 35% gains on the GPU, but no gains on the CPU. And Apple was really tight-lipped about all of this stuff. Like, the only way that we've been able to figure it out is by comparing the iPad mini to the old one, and then the last year's iPad Air to the old iPad Air with the same chip. Now, there's been some speculation as to the cause behind this apparent slowdown in Apple's chip design. One article says that in 2019, Nuvia was founded and later acquired by Qualcomm, and a lot of Apple's engineers have been leaving to join the firm. There's apparently also a new startup which includes several senior Apple engineers. So it seems, at least on face value, as though Apple is starting to lose some of the engineers and the tech teams that have driven the incredible pace of iPhone chip design. Now, I'm not sure how much of that is sensationalist, how much of that is reading into something that doesn't necessarily have a correlation here, right? So when companies lose people, we always hear news about like Tesla's taking people from Ford, and then Apple was taking people from Ford to work on their car, and then they're losing them back to other car companies. And it does make you wonder, like, how much of that is actually having an effect. I'm sure in some cases it does, but I'm sure Apple is able to find extremely talented and high qualified engineers that want to work on their chip design. Apple themselves is said to be experimenting with new RISC-V chips. There's job openings that reveal that it's exploring how it might be able to use this new open source processor tech that would compete with ARM as a potential direction for the company to go in. So to think that Apple is just kind of sitting around as all of their engineers are leaving willy-nilly doesn't really hold up to scrutiny, right? They're the richest company in the world. They can afford to hire talent. So what does this mean for the A15? It's a fun little rhyme. Well, the traditional wisdom, which is incredibly valid, is that iPhone chips don't really need to get any faster. If you have an iPhone that's running any of the Bionic chips, so the A11, 12, 13, 14, then I guarantee that you have almost never experienced a situation where the phone felt slow. My personal read on the situation tends to fall somewhere in the middle of that argument. On the one hand, I definitely don't think that Apple needs to improve year over year on the chips. They're already very fast. But on the other hand, Apple has done that in the past, and it does show that they're making progress, and it has effects for the rest of their lineup. So for that to be absent, well, it doesn't necessarily affect the user experience of the iPhone, might be concerning for the future of Apple Silicon. Right now, the rumors about M1X seem to be basically an M1 with more cores. And that's great, but there's only so far that you can go adding more cores before you run into thermal, die size, manufacturing limitations. See, when you add cores, as we're expecting with the M1X, it makes the chip physically larger. And that introduces a whole bunch of complications. Number one, that's a lot more surface area that you then need to cool. That's one of the biggest benefits of switching to Apple Silicon in the Mac, is that they've run really cool and had incredible performance. But when you increase the chip size, it's going to generate more heat. The other issue is when you create a larger chip, it's harder to manufacture because your typical wafer, which is a circular piece of silicon that has the chips stamped onto it, there's going to be less chips on that circular wafer because the chips are physically larger. So that means that your yields go down and your cost for production goes up. I'd like to be optimistic here. Apple is working on a 3nm process that should allow another round of impressive gains with the same number of cores. However, there's only so far that you can go, and the pace at which they have been moving through these different processes has definitely slowed down, because once you get smaller and smaller and smaller, you kind of reach a point where it's hard to really work around that limitation of size. But I definitely wouldn't be surprised if the pace at which their processors gain on the Mac side isn't as prodigious as it has been on the iPhone in years past. Now, the one area where I would have an exception to that is with the GPU. I'm really curious about the GPU on this new iPhone, because it seems like there are pretty respectable gains. And that is really big news, because the M1 chip, which was based off of the iPhone 14's performance and efficiency cores as well as GPU cores, was very, very powerful from a CPU perspective. But the GPU wasn't as incredible. It was still very good, right? For integrated graphics, it was still absolutely fantastic, but it wasn't as sort of mind-blowing and next level as the M1 CPU. So if Apple is able to increase the GPU cores, right? We're expecting the M1X to have 16 or 32 GPU cores, and if those cores are in themselves 20% faster than the cores used in M1, that's a massive leap. That is a simply monumental gain for what has always been Apple's weak point, graphics. Even before the Apple Silicon transition, when they were using AMD, and even before that with NVIDIA, Macs never really had the most powerful graphics. They were never graphics powerhouses. But with these kinds of gains and that number of core increases for the M1X and beyond, that is going to be really exciting. And I'm definitely going to be keeping my eyes peeled wide open for those GPUs. Oh, my eyes are dry now. I'm curious to know what you guys think about all of this. Do you think that Apple is running out of steam, or do you think that they're just in between process shifts and that they'll be back on the high horse next year with some pretty incredible gains? Let me know in the comments below. My take on this whole thing is that I'm mildly concerned, but I'm gonna need to see how M1X is shaping up, get my hands on the A15 before I have any real judgments on whether or not Apple is slipping in the CPU game. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next video.